Close your eyes. Take a slow breath in and let it go. You don't need to be anywhere right now. You don't need to do anything. There is nothing waiting for you tonight except this. A long, quiet story about a place that once existed, a place that was once alive, and a place that now rests silently beneath still water. Let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you are resting. Feel the weight of your arms, the weight of your legs, the soft heaviness behind your eyes. Everything is calm, everything is slow. And as I begin to speak, you can simply let the words drift over you, like water over smooth stone. We are going to a valley, a long, wide, beautiful valley in the hills of western Massachusetts. The year is 1930, and the valley is called the Swift River Valley. It sits between gentle forested ridges, and through its center runs the Swift River, a narrow, clear river that moves slowly in summer and fills with ice in winter. The sound it makes as it moves over the rocks is the kind of sound that people who grew up beside it never fully forget. There are 4 small towns in this valley: Enfield, Greenwich, Prescott, Dana. They are quiet towns, modest towns, towns where the same families have lived for 200 years, where the church at the center of town has the same white steeple it had in 1790, where the general store smells of wood smoke and coffee and pine resin, where the roads are unpaved and the horses still know the route home without being told. You are walking into Dana now. It is early morning. The light is coming through the trees at a low golden angle, falling in long stripes across the dirt road that runs through the center of town. The air is cool and sharp and smells of autumn. Dry leaves, damp earth, the faint sweetness of apples from someone's orchard at the edge of the hill. The town is just beginning to wake up. Somewhere ahead of you, a screen door opens and closes. A dog trots out from behind a white fence and pauses to look at you, tail wagging once before it moves on. The sound of a wood stove being stoked comes from an open window. A low, deliberate tapping, and then the quiet creak of the iron door closing again. You walk slowly down the main road. There is no hurry here. There has never been any hurry in Dana. The pace of this town is the pace of seasons, of weather, of the river. The people who live here have shaped their lives around the rhythm of the land, and the land has shaped its features around the presence of the people, so that after 200 years, the two are almost impossible to separate. On your left, there is a white farmhouse with a long porch. The boards of the porch are gray with age, softened at the edges, warm underfoot. A rocking chair sits at one end, and in that rocking chair an old man sits with a cup of something hot held in both hands. He doesn't say anything as you pass. He only nods, slow and easy, and looks back out toward the tree line. On your right there is a small white church. The door is closed, but the windows on either side glow faintly with the light of oil lamps being lit inside. Someone is preparing for the morning service. Someone is setting out the hymnals, smoothing the cloth on the altar, opening the shutters just slightly to let in the cool air. You keep walking. The road bends slightly as it passes the general store, and through the window you can see the shelves lined with tins and jars, bolts of fabric, a glass case with tobacco and peppermint sticks. The storekeeper is behind the counter, writing something in a large ledger, his glasses pushed far down his nose, a pencil tucked behind one ear. Further along there is the one-room schoolhouse. It is empty this early, its long wooden desks waiting in rows, the blackboard still chalky from yesterday's lesson, the loops of cursive letters still visible at the top, the long column of arithmetic below. A vase on the teacher's desk holds dried goldenrod, gone pale and papery with the season. You reach the far end of town and look back. The morning light has warmed now, shifting from gold to a softer white, and the whole town is visible from here. The steeple, the rooftops, the wisps of chimney smoke, drifting upward and then dissolving. The sound of the river comes from somewhere below, steady and low, winding through the meadow at the edge of the valley. It is an ordinary morning. It is exactly like 10,000 other mornings this valley has seen. And yet, if you knew what was coming, if someone had told you, standing here in 1930, looking back at the white steeple and the gray porch boards and the schoolhouse with the goldenrod, you might not have been able to leave, because this morning, like every morning, Dana is alive, and in 15 years it will be gone. Breathe slowly. Let your shoulders drop. You are completely safe. You are warm. And the story is long and gentle, and there is nowhere you need to be. The reason 4 towns disappeared beneath water begins, as many American stories do, with the city that needed something. Boston was growing. Through the late 1800s and into the early 20th century, the population of metropolitan Boston expanded faster than its water supply could keep pace with. The reservoirs that fed the city were adequate for the city Boston had been. They were not adequate for the city Boston was becoming. And so the engineers and the planners and the politicians began to look at maps, to trace the watersheds, to measure the rainfall, to calculate the volumes of water that could be collected and stored and moved through aqueducts over distance. They looked at many places, and eventually they looked at the Swift River Valley. The valley was ideal. Its geography created a natural bowl. The hills rising on all sides, the river running through the center, the watershed feeding steadily from snow and rain year after year. If you built a dam at the eastern end of the valley, the water would have nowhere to go but up. It would fill slowly, rising through the meadows, rising through the orchards, rising through the streets of Dana and Enfield and Greenwich and Prescott, until the whole valley became a single still, enormous reservoir. The engineers calculated that this reservoir, when full, would hold 412 billion gallons of water. They calculated that it would take approximately 7 years to fill. They calculated the cost. They calculated the engineering requirements. They calculated the timeline for relocating the roads and the railroads that pass through the valley. What they did not put a number on, what perhaps cannot be given a number, was what it would mean to the 1,800 people who lived in those 4 towns, to the families whose grandparents were buried in the churchyard at Dana, to the farmers whose fields had been cleared by hand 2 centuries before, to the children who had grown up swimming in the Swift River, catching crayfish under the flat stones, skating on the flooded meadow in January. The announcement came in 1927. The valley would be flooded. The towns would be demolished. The people would have to leave. And a place that had been home to families for 7 generations would disappear beneath the surface of a man-made lake and never be seen again. Let your breath slow even further now. In and out, in and out. The room around you is quiet, The world outside is quiet. There is only this valley and this story and the long, slow passage of time. The years between 1927 and 1938 were the years of leaving. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way most losses happen, gradually, then suddenly, with long stretches of ordinary life in between, broken by moments of sharp and undeniable grief. At first, many people in the valley did not fully believe it would happen. The announcement had been made, yes. The legislation had passed in Boston, yes. But the valley had been here for 2 centuries. The towns had been here for 2 centuries. The steeple of the church in Enfield had watched over the valley through the Revolution and the Civil War and the Great Blizzard of 1888. There were people in Dana who had been born in the same bedroom their parents had been born in and their grandparents before them. The idea that all of it could simply be decided away, voted on in a building far from this valley by men who had never walked its roads or swum in its river or sat on its porches at dusk listening to the frogs, seemed for a while impossible. But the surveyors came. They came with their instruments and their notebooks and their careful measurements, walking the fields and the roads and the banks of the river, marking out the elevation lines that showed where the water would reach. They drove small wooden stakes into the ground at the places that would one day be underwater. They were polite men, quiet men, doing their work with professional thoroughness, and their presence was its own kind of message. And slowly, one by one, families began to sell. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts purchased the properties as they became available. The farmhouses, the general stores, the mill, the school, the church, the blacksmith's building, the town hall. They purchased them at assessed values that were fair by the standards of the law and inadequate by the standards of what was actually being taken. Because what was being taken was not just property. What was being taken was a life, a world, a way of being in a place. You can imagine what it felt like to sign the paper, to hand over the deed to the house where you were born, to walk out the front door for the last time, to turn and look back at the windows, at the porch, at the garden your mother had planted and tended for 40 years, to feel the weight of that moment, the strange, hollow enormity of it, and then to get into your car or your wagon and drive up the hill and out of the valley and not come back. Some people left quickly. They took the money, found a new place to live, and tried to put the distance between themselves and what they had lost before the grief could fully settle. They moved to Worcester, to Springfield, to small towns in the Connecticut River Valley. They unpacked their things in new houses on new streets and tried to build new routines in places where no one knew their name. Others stayed as long as they possibly could. There were people in Dana who stayed until the very last year, until the town was being demolished around them, until the only houses left standing were the ones waiting for the wrecking crew. They stayed because they could not bring themselves to leave, because leaving felt like a second kind of loss, like losing the town once through the decision that had been made, and then losing it again through their own departure. They watched the demolition begin. The buildings were taken down systematically. The town hall went first, then the school, then the stores, then the houses. The materials were salvaged where they could be: bricks, timber, doors, windows, and carted away to be used elsewhere. What could not be salvaged was burned or buried. The orchards were cut down. The stone walls that had taken generations to build were pushed over. The old cemetery was carefully exhumed, and the graves were moved, every headstone, every set of remains, to a new cemetery on higher ground, on land that would not be flooded. The graves were moved. But the land they had rested in was not moved. The land stayed. The land would always stay. And then the dam was finished, and the gates were closed, and the swift river was stopped, and the water began to rise. Let your body rest completely now. Feel the weight of sleep beginning to gather at the edges of your thoughts. Let it come slowly. There is still so much of this story left to tell. The rising of the water was not dramatic. This is the thing about the filling of a reservoir. It is not a flood. It does not rush. It does not surge. It rises the way water always rises when there is nowhere for it to go. Steadily, patiently, indifferently. A few inches a week. A few feet over a month. The process so slow that if you stood at the edge of the valley and watched, you would not be able to see it happening. But you could measure it. And week by week, the measurements showed the water rising. First, the meadows at the valley floor went under. The low, marshy ground along the river banks, where the cattails grew and the red-winged blackbirds nested, and the frogs called on warm spring nights. That ground simply became wet, and then wetter, and then disappeared. Then the river itself was gone. Or rather, the river became something else, became part of something larger, lost its banks and its character and its particular voice against particular stones. Then the lower roads went under. Then the foundations of the demolished buildings. The square, dark holes in the earth where the houses had stood, filled with water and were lost. Then the stone walls. Then the old cellar holes. Then the last of the cleared land. And still the water kept rising. By 1939, the Quabbin Reservoir, as it was now called, named for a native word meaning something like a place of many waters or a meeting of waters, was taking shape. Its surface was enormous, stretching for miles through what had been the valley, its edges irregular and forested, its water clear and cold and still. From above, it looked like something that had always been there. From the hills that surrounded it, looking down at the long, silver expanse of it in the morning light, a person who had not known the valley might have thought it was a natural lake, one of those deep, cold, glacial lakes that New England is full of. A beautiful, quiet, ancient thing. But it was not ancient. It was 18 years old. And beneath it, in the cold and the dark and the silence, lay the world that had been. Close your eyes a little more completely now. Let the story carry you. We are going down. Not in a frightening way. Not into anything dark or cold or sorrowful. We are going down gently, the way thoughts go down in the moments before sleep. We are going down into the valley as it was, into the memory of it, into the long, quiet existence of it. Let us go to Greenwich first. Greenwich was the smallest of the four towns. It sat in the southern part of the valley, sheltered by a ridge of hills on the west, open to the river on the east. Its population was never more than a few hundred people, and it wore that smallness with a kind of settled comfort. The way small things that have been in their place for a long time wear their smallness, without apology and without ambition. The center of Greenwich was a wide, flat common, a rectangle of grass kept close cropped by the sheep that grazed there in summer, ringed on three sides by the town's main buildings, the church on the north end, the town hall on the south, a row of houses along the east, their doorways facing the common, their gardens running back to the edge of the trees. In summer, the common was the center of everything. Children played there in the long evenings, their voices carrying in the warm air, their games continuing past the point where it was fully light, until their mothers called from the doorways, and they ran home through the grass with the fireflies beginning to rise around them. In winter, the common was a different place, white and still and quiet under its coat of snow. The church windows glowing warmly from inside, the tracks of animals crossing from one tree line to another in the clean, cold air. The church in Greenwich was called the First Congregational Church of Greenwich. It had been built in 1754, and it had stood in that same spot for 176 years before the water came. Its bell had rung every Sunday morning, and on the days of funerals, and on the days of celebration, and once, in 1775, when word came of the battle at Lexington and the men of Greenwich gathered on the common to decide what to do, that bell was saved. Before the demolition, the bell was taken down from the steeple and moved to a church in another town, where it still rings on Sundays. But the steeple it rang from, and the building it was part of, and the common it looked out over, and the grass where children played on summer evenings, all of that is under the water now, under the still, cold, quiet water of the Quabbin. Breathe slowly, in and out. Let the images come slowly, like scenes from a dream. Now let us go to Enfield. Enfield was the largest of the four towns, the commercial heart of the valley. It had a hotel, a post office, a railroad station, a mill, and a main street long enough that walking from one end to the other gave you a sense of real distance, real purpose, real arrival. The hotel was called the Enfield Hotel, and it was a comfortable, unpretentious place. White clapboard, 3 stories, a long porch facing the street, rocking chairs spaced evenly along the porch rail. Traveling salesmen stayed there, and families visiting from the city, and the occasional tourist who had come to see the valley in the fall when the trees turned. The dining room of the Enfield Hotel served meals 3 times a day. Breakfast was eggs and toast and oatmeal and coffee so strong it was almost black. Dinner at midday was meat and potatoes and some kind of pie. Apple in the fall, blueberry in summer, dried apple in winter. Supper in the evening was simpler. Bread and soup and whatever was left from dinner. The tables in the dining room were covered with white cloths, worn smooth with years of washing, and in the center of each table there was a small vase with whatever was in season. A few asters in September, holly in December, forsythia branches forced to bloom in February. The cook was a woman named Mrs. Hartwell, who had been cooking at the Enfield Hotel for 30 years, and whose pie crust was the subject of reverence in 3 counties. She was a small, precise woman who kept her kitchen with an order bordering on severity, and who showed her affection for her guests not through warmth of manner, but through the quality of what she put in front of them. When the hotel was demolished, Mrs. Hartwell moved to Springfield. She lived there for 20 more years in a small apartment on a quiet street, and she cooked in a church kitchen on Sundays. And she was known in her neighborhood for the pies she brought to new families and the sick and the grieving. She never spoke much about the hotel, or about Enfield, or about the valley, but sometimes it was said when the afternoon light came through her apartment window at a certain angle, she would stop whatever she was doing and stand very still for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. And then she would go back to work, breathe in and out. The light is low and golden now. The story continues. There were things that made the valley different from any other place. Small things. Things that only the people who lived there would know to miss. There was a particular stretch of the river just north of Enfield, where the water ran over a series of flat ledge stones and made a sound that was different from the sound the river made anywhere else. A lower, fuller sound, almost musical, like the lowest note of something longer. Children growing up in the valley had this sound as a kind of background, a constant beneath everything else, present in summer when the river was high and fast, present in fall when it was lower and slower, present even in winter as a muffled suggestion beneath the ice. There was a stand of sugar maples on the hill above Dana that turned in October with a particular intensity of color. Not just orange or red, but a deep, burning red that seemed to generate its own light in the early morning, so that people driving the road beneath it would slow down without meaning to, drawn by the quality of the color, unable to pass it quickly. There was a view from the top of Prescott Hill, a view that had no name, that had never been written about or photographed in any significant way, that simply existed as a thing the people of the valley knew, where on clear days you could see beyond the surrounding ridges the faint blue line of mountains to the west and the great wide sky above them, and the sense of depth and distance and beautiful emptiness that certain views can give you, the sense of the world being larger than you usually remember. These things are not under the water. These things existed only in the experience of being present for them, and when the people left, they took those experiences with them, carried them in memory through new lives in new places, passing some of them in words and some of them in silence to children and grandchildren who would never see the maple stand or hear the river or look out from Prescott Hill at the far blue mountains. That is what it means for a place to disappear. Not just the buildings, not just the roads, but the particular texture of being alive in that place, the quality of the light on a specific morning, the sound of a door opening in a house that no longer stands, the smell of someone else's bread baking, carried on a breeze from a direction that is now the middle of a lake. All of that goes too. All of that goes into the water and does not come back. Let your thoughts soften now. Let the edges of everything go a little blurry. The story is becoming slower, quieter, more like the lake itself. The last official event in the Swift River Valley before the flooding was complete was called the Farewell Ball. It was held on April 27th, 1938, in the town hall in Enfield. The largest building still standing, one of the last to be demolished. Several hundred people came. They came from all 4 towns, and they came from the towns they had moved to, from Worcester and Springfield and Ware and Belchertown and all the other places the valley's people had scattered to in the years since the announcement. They came in their good clothes, the women in their best dresses, the men in their dark suits. And they came in the knowledge that this was a goodbye, not just to the town hall and not just to Enfield, but to the valley itself, to the world they had grown up in, to something that could not be replaced. The hall was decorated with bunting and flowers. A band played, waltzes and polkas, and old tunes that everyone knew. The floor was crowded with dancers, and the edges of the room were lined with people who did not dance, but who stood talking, holding cups of punch, laughing at old stories, looking around the room as if trying to memorize it. There were people there who had been born in the valley and had never lived anywhere else, who were now in their 70s and 80s and who had watched the valley shrink around them as, one by one, the families left and the buildings came down and the stone walls were pushed over. These people danced that night with the heaviness beneath their movement, a knowledge that when the music stopped, there would be no tomorrow in this place, that the day after the farewell ball, Enfield would still technically exist, but the life of it would be over. An old woman named Mabel Wheeler danced every dance that night. She was 73 years old, and she had lived her entire life in the valley, in a house that had already been demolished, and she was staying with a neighbor in the last weeks before that neighbor's house, too, would be taken down. She danced every dance with whoever would dance with her. Her nephew, an old friend from Greenwich, a young man she had never met who was visiting from Springfield, and who took her hand when the music started and guided her through a waltz with the careful solemnity of someone who understood the weight of what the evening meant. When the last song was played and the music stopped, she stood in the middle of the floor and looked around the room for a long moment. Then she put on her coat, said goodnight to the people near her, and walked out into the April night. She moved to Springfield the following week. She lived there for 11 more years. The ball was over. The valley was almost over, and the water kept rising. Breathe slowly, in and out. You're very close to sleep now. Let the words continue to come, soft and slow. In the decades after the reservoir was completed, the world around the Quabbin changed. The cities grew. Roads were built and widened. Forests came and went. Whole communities rose up in places that had been farmland and fell quiet in places that had been busy. The century moved through itself with its usual combination of beauty and disaster, its wars and its inventions, its losses and its discoveries. But the Quabbin stayed. The water in the reservoir was still and cold and extraordinarily clear. Over the years, the surrounding forest grew back and thickened into something close to wilderness, one of the largest roadless areas in southern New England. Bald eagles returned to nest in the tall pines along the shore, the first breeding pair in Massachusetts in 100 years. Moose moved through the forest at the water's edge. Loons called across the surface of the reservoir in the early mornings, their voices carrying across the water in that particular way that loon calls do, carrying further than seems possible, arriving before you expect them, hanging in the air after the bird has stopped calling. The reservoir became, over time, one of the most beautiful places in Massachusetts. People came to walk the roads that still existed at its edges, old roads that had once connected the valley towns to the outside world and now led only to viewpoints over the water. They came to watch the eagles. They came to fish. They came to stand at the edge of the water and look out across the long silver surface of it at the forested hills on the far side, at the sky reflected in it, at the absolute stillness of it on a windless day. And some of them came because of the towns, because the story had passed through time, the way stories do, and there were people who knew that beneath this beautiful quiet water there was a valley, and in that valley there had been 4 towns, and in those 4 towns there had been families who had lived there for generations, who had been born and married and buried there, who had known this specific light on this specific land, and had been told that they had to leave it. These people stood at the edge of the water and looked down. The water is not transparent. You cannot see through it to the bottom, to the old roads and the old cellar holes, and the graves that had been moved, and the orchards that had been cut down. The water is simply water, clear and cold and still, holding its secrets in the usual way that deep water does. But knowing what is there changes the looking. Knowing that somewhere beneath the surface, if you could dive deep enough and go far enough, you would find the outline of a road, a stone wall, a depression in the ground where a foundation once stood. Knowing that the valley is still there, just as the glacier left it, just as the river shaped it, just as the families lived in it, just covered, just quiet, just waiting in the way that things underwater wait, without urgency, without hope, without anything at all. That knowledge makes the looking different. It makes the silence of the reservoir feel fuller. It makes the still surface feel less like an absence and more like a presence. The presence of everything that is held beneath it. Close your eyes completely now. You are almost asleep. The water is around you, not cold, not dark, just still. And the valley is below you, just the way it was. There is a man. There have been many men and women, but let us follow one, whose name was Roy Nichols. Roy Nichols was born in Greenwich in 1901, the youngest of 4 children, in the white farmhouse on the south side of the common. His father was a farmer, and his mother was a school teacher, and Roy grew up with the specific combination of practical knowledge and intellectual curiosity that such parents tend to produce. He knew how to mend a fence and how to read a barometer and how to tell from the behavior of the cattle in the morning whether rain was coming, and he also knew Latin and could recite long passages from the King James Bible and had read more books than most people in the valley would read in their lifetimes. He went to college in Amherst on a scholarship and came back to Greenwich at 22 with a teaching certificate and a deep settled love for the valley that his 4 years away had only made clearer. He taught school in Greenwich for 12 years. He taught reading and arithmetic and history to the children of the valley, and he taught them the history of the valley itself. The original Nipmuc people who had lived along the river, the English settlers who had come in the 1700s, the slow building of the towns over generations. When the announcement came in 1927, Roy Nichols was 26 years old and had been teaching for 4 years. He did not leave quickly. He stayed and taught until the school was closed, and then he helped the town archivist collect and preserve the records, the birth certificates, the marriage records, the land deeds, the meeting minutes going back to the 1700s. He photographed the buildings before they were demolished with a camera he had bought secondhand from a photographer in Amherst, walking the streets of all 4 towns with his camera and his notebooks, trying to capture something of what was being lost. He moved to Ware in 1936, 2 years before the farewell ball. He taught school there for 30 years. He married a woman from Springfield. and they had 3 children, and the children grew up in Ware and did not know the valley except through their father's stories and his photographs and the particular quality of sadness that settled over him occasionally, in the autumn especially, when the light was right. In 1960, when Roy Nichols was 59 years old, the authorities who managed the Quabbin Reservoir opened certain roads around the reservoir to the public for the first time. Visitors could now walk the old roads, look out at the water, see the hills. Roy Nichols drove to the reservoir on the first day it was open. He parked his car at the gate and walked the old road that led toward where Greenwich had been. The road was still there, overgrown at the edges, but intact. The same road he had walked to school on as a child. The same road where the puddles froze in November and the mud came back in March. He walked until the road ended at the water's edge. He stood there for a long time. The water was still and silver, and the trees on the far shore were reflected in it, upside down, perfect. An eagle was circling, very high, barely visible against the pale sky. The only sound was the faint movement of the water at the edge of the road. A small, gentle lapping, barely a sound at all. Roy Nichols stood at the edge of the water, where the common of Greenwich had been, and he did not speak, and he did not cry, and he did not take any photographs. He stood there until the light began to change, until the silver of the water shifted toward gold, until the reflections of the trees on the far shore stretched and blurred. Then he walked back to his car, and he drove home. He came back every year after that until he was too old to make the walk. And every year he stood at the same spot at the edge of the water and looked out across the still surface of the reservoir at the hills and the sky and the silence. And every year the water gave back nothing, and every year he came anyway. Let your breath go slow and long now. Your body is heavy and warm. The story is almost done, but not quite. There is something about a submerged place that is different from a destroyed place. A place that burns, a place that is torn down, a place that is buried under concrete or asphalt. Those places are gone in the way that gone usually means. The thing that was there is no longer there. The space has been transformed into something else. But a place that is underwater is not transformed. It is preserved, not perfectly, not in any way that a visitor could experience directly. The water does its work over decades. The wood rots, the plaster dissolves, the metal corrodes, the stone walls slowly settle and shift. By now, 80 years after the flooding, the physical traces of the valley's towns are fragmentary at best, visible in some places as faint outlines in the silt and sediment at the bottom of the reservoir, recognizable to the informed eye but invisible to anyone else. But the shape of the land does not change. The hills are where they were. The river valley is where it was. The rise and fall of the land beneath the water is identical to the rise and fall of the land above the water. If you could somehow drain the Quabbin tomorrow, if you could lower the water and walk back into the valley, you would find the same contours, the same slopes, the same meadows and woodlands and stream channels that were there before the water came. The valley is still the valley. It is just held in a different kind of silence now. And there is something in that, in the idea of a place continuing to exist beneath the surface of something else, maintaining its shape, its contours, its essential geography, while the world above it moves through decades of change. There is something in that which is almost comforting, as if continuity is not only possible but inevitable, as if the things that have been lost are not destroyed but only covered, as if beneath every surface there are layers of what was preserved in the sediment of time, waiting with the patience of geology for some future moment when the water recedes or the sediment shifts or someone finds a way to look down far enough to see. Breathe in very slowly, and out, and in. The weight of sleep is all around you now. The story is settling. It is late afternoon at the Quabbin Reservoir. The summer has been long and warm, and the water level is a little lower than usual. The pale rock of the shoreline exposed in pale gray rings where the water has receded. The surface of the reservoir catches the late sun at a low angle and turns it to gold, broken only by the slow, wide circles of a fish rising somewhere near the center. There is no one here. The last visitors left an hour ago, 2 women walking a dog along the road at the edge of the water, and the sound of them faded around the bend and was absorbed into the quiet. Now there is only the water and the light and the sound of the wind in the pines, a very high, very soft sound, almost like breathing. The eagle is back. It comes in low from the east, its wingspan so wide it seems impossible for something that large to move so quietly, and it settles into the top of a dead pine at the water's edge. It sits there, absolutely still, looking out across the reservoir with the patient attention of something that has all the time there is. The light shifts. The gold of the water deepens toward orange, toward amber, and the reflections of the trees on the far shore break apart and reassemble with each small movement of the surface. Somewhere in the depth of the water, beneath the light and the reflections, beneath the cold, dark layers where the light does not reach, the valley rests. The roads, the common, the white steeple, long since dissolved, its outline perhaps still visible as a faint irregularity in the silt. The cellar hole of Roy Nichols' farmhouse. The flat ledge stones where the river made its low, full sound. The maple stand on the hill above Dana, its roots still in the same earth, its outline still in the same hillside, just underwater now, just quiet. All of it resting, all of it held. And the water above it still and cold and indifferent, and somehow, in its indifference, kind, not erasing what is below but covering it, the way darkness covers a sleeping face, without judgment, without urgency, with only the particular gentleness of something that does not need anything from you. Close your eyes. You are there, at the edge of the water. The light is golden and low. The eagle is still. The valley is below you, just the way it was. And everything is quiet. Everything is still. And you can rest now. You can let the weight of the day go completely. Let it sink away from you the way the valley sank beneath the water. Slowly, gently, without drama, without loss. Just resting. Just still. Just held in the quiet of something larger than you. Breathe in and out, in and out. The water is still. The valley is there. And you are safe and warm and held. And there is nothing to do now but sleep. Sleep now. Sleep. The water is still. The light is going. And the valley rests beneath it all as it has rested for 80 years, quiet and whole and enduring. Just like you. Quiet, whole, and enduring. Sleep.